Next from Chicago, we talk with Michael Jacoby, the executive director of the Illinois Association of School Business Officials, about the difficulties many Illinois school districts face managing their budget during Illinois' poor economy. This runs about 12 minutes.
Mike Jacoby with the Illinois Association of School Business Officials. Thanks for joining us again. And we're in Chicago at a educational conference, a variety of different groups, yours, Illinois Association of School Boards, Illinois School Administrators. A lot of people probably don't know of your organization, the business officials of the schools. On the other hand, given the state's finances, you guys might be having the hardest job of anybody right now. What are some of your, before we get into the details, your overall view of where are we right now? What are you hearing from the trenches as far as trying to make the schools work in a business sense?
Well, I think honestly the schools have probably gone through the hardest fiscal time over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, this year we're looking at 60% of the district's deficit budgeting, and if there's a fall off on revenue, which everyone is predicting with the expiration of the income tax, that could climb to as high as 75%. And so what that does is it makes it a very challenging job at the district level for a business official to try and balance that. Balance the use of current resources, balance, how do we make cuts, how do we make sure our budgets are balanced when we don't necessarily even know what our revenue stream is going to be until late in the fiscal year. So there are a lot of challenges. I think our folks have worked pretty hard at it, but it's just a difficult scenario.
Well, and let's talk about, so a lot of the schools running into a deficit, which means they've got to find the money somewhere. I suspect it's coming from some of the schools have foundations, so they have some money parked on the side. But there's only so much money there. And because the state's been struggling for a while, you've probably been looking to cut everywhere you can for several years now. So you're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel on the cuts, I would guess, too, in some ways.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I was talking to Superintendent in the Metro East area, and basically saying we have cut all the things that we think we can other than just the regular classroom. But unfortunately what that means is that we're not serving students, especially students with special needs, in the way we would really like to. And honestly, I think that's sort of a travesty, because some of the things that you can do instructionally to really advance student achievement, things like instructional coaches or a little bit more reasonable class size at the lower kindergarten 1-2 level, those things are kind of off the table. And those have really great impact on student achievement, and yet we can't do those in a down economy, in a down budget cycle like this.
Now, the state this is a misnomer. It's a funding foundation. In other words, it's a level below which we're not supposed to go, that we're going to guarantee $6,119 per pupil per year. But the state's not doing that. They're only spending about 89% of that now. And I think when you had said 75%, were you referring to that might fall to 75% of the 6,100 level? Is that what you were referring to?
No, I was talking about the percentage of districts that are deficit spending.
Oh, in deficit spending.
Right.
So, but still, and I've heard some other people talk, we're at 89%, that might fall even more. And some of the schools, and this gets us to SB 16, they're trying to figure out the funding formula. You have some areas where schools, obviously, let's say in the DuPage County area, you're going to have a lot of business. You're going to have $300,000, $400,000 homes that are paying taxes. They're going to be spending somewhere in the area of $15,000 a year per pupil. You have other areas in more rural or downstate small communities. The homes might be only $30,000. So the amount of tax you're getting off of that is negligible. Mm-hmm. So you have a gap of maybe $15,000 to $2,000 as far as what's generated from local property taxes. I'm just trying to lay it out. What's the challenge for this? Whether SB 16 is the right way or not? Right. What are your thoughts on it in general, with that kind of as a foundation for the people to understand?
Right. Well, from the very beginning, we have said this is the best conversation we could be having about how to get more resources to schools that need those resources. One of the things, though, that we also have tried to say is if Senate Bill 16 is going to be the most viable way for us to move forward, we probably need to not only have the equity side, the sort of just the redistribution of current resources, but we need to talk about what would be an adequate amount of spending for a local district to actually deliver a good program for kids. What we're afraid of is becoming equally inadequate, and that's not going to really benefit students anywhere. Most
So you
states,
take the schools that are adequately funded, and by taking the money away, they would be
they
no
become
longer
inadequate, right? And and every resource right now is being driven towards some sort of student experience. So, every dollar you're going to take away, even from a district that might be spending more, you're going to be taking something away from that student experience, that student opportunity in that district. Most states, when they've gone through a revision of their funding, where they wanted to get more resources into schools that have the most need, they've usually said, we're going to kind of start from where we are, and we're going to increase the resources to those schools that have need, as opposed to the Robin Hood effect, perhaps, of taking away from some and giving it to others. Now, we're neutral on the bill in terms of Senate Bill 16, because there are some districts that would really gain effectively a lot of resource there.
Yeah, you have members that both win and lose.
Right. But we want to speak into that in an effective way. And so what we have proposed, and this goes to some of the Vision 2020 work that we're doing along with the other associations, is that we give some focus to adequacy. Yes, it may be years before we can really fund it, but we'd rather have a target that says, here's what we think is a quality education that would be appropriate for every child in Illinois as a baseline. And then let's get ourselves there over some period of years. As the economy maybe turns around, or as we have different tax resources, or we revitalize our tax policy under the new governor, whatever the case might be. But let's have an adequacy conversation along with the equity conversation to make it viable.
Have you had an opportunity as yet to speak to the governor-elect?
Not directly to the governor-elect. We've met with his one person from his education transition team, and with a couple of his policy analysts, and we've talked about those kinds of issues. There seems to be some resonance with the idea that we need to put more resources into education to make sure we've got an adequacy flow going for students in districts all across the state. And we're welcoming them to really kind of walk alongside us as we continue to promote our vision.
One of the other items before we wrap up, I think we've talked before, it's hard when people are, the legislature doesn't pass its budget until the end of May, but school officials have to be making hiring and firing decisions, not firing decisions, but hiring decisions in say April, and you don't know if you're going to have the funds for those 3 new teachers you feel you need to add in a certain spot. So to what extent would Vision 2020 help smooth out those funding speed bumps that you run into, to where you're almost like throwing darts hoping that you're going to get this revenue, because a lot of your schools are making those kind of decisions based on projections that may or may not be true?
Right. Well, what we're promoting is a 2-year budget cycle. It might not be a formal budget for 2 years, but at least some sort of recognition of what education funding might be like in a second year. We know that every legislature is going to have to make their own decision on every budget that they do annually at this particular point. But there's a budget implementation bill that's always associated with the legislators' work. And if they wanted to say, for instance, this year it's going to be $6119 and next year it's going to be $6,500, they can come back to that $6,500 figure maybe next year, but at least it forecasts what districts might be able to expect. And we think that sort of would be a reasonable way to get at the dilemma. April 1, we have to give notices. Every school has to tell all of their employees whether or not they're going to be back for next year. And then you don't get your revenue stream solidified until the legislature does their work at the end of May. So now you're middle of June, you're trying to rehire teachers, or you're trying to put in place a really good quality, high quality team for August 20. That's a very short time frame, and typically it ends up being sort of inefficient, really, in terms of being able to deliver a good set of programs to kids.
Let me make this the last question, but anyway. But the point would be, Have your members given thought to, or do you have your thoughts on, does Illinois rely too heavily on local property taxes? Because on one hand, people might have those $300,000 or $400,000 homes, but they don't want to be taxed out of their homes. And every time their tax goes up, then their budget gets broken. Have you looked at different states? Are there better funding models that maybe don't rely as much on property taxes for the schools?
Any state that has implemented an adequacy mindset where they're saying the state's role is to make up the difference between what you can do at a local level and what you deem to be an adequate cost of education for every child. When they have actually targeted that adequacy level, they typically have equalized the playing field. Now, it might be equity at a minimally adequate level, and there may still be districts that spend much more than that. But in the end, it's about making sure that every child has at least a sort of minimal adequate program that they can depend on. And states that have done that, they have closed those gaps.
From a different funding source than
from their state resources. The reason we have a general state aid formula in a state is to try and equalize against the fact that we have different local wealth throughout the state. In states where...
So, the idea is simple. Look, if you're lucky enough to have parents that are wealthy and live in a well-to-do community, you're going to have a phenomenal education.
Exactly.
But the people who didn't win the birth lottery and are living in an impoverished area should at least have an adequate education.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. And right now, the property taxes have been a pretty stable revenue across the state. But again, it does make a difference. It's local as opposed to statewide. And therefore, state programs of general state aid, that's what fills in the gap. And again, if we're looking at an adequate number, it usually makes the difference.
Well, Mike Jacoby, I'm sure we'll be talking again. There's a lot to go about, but we'll let you go, and thanks for joining us again.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks. Good talk with you.